This is the 13th session of Tanakh and the Halakhic mindset in the Semicha program. We got to the book of Mishlei, Proverbs, which is composed of many short sayings, some of which are organized in larger units. People don't usually associate Mishlei with Halakha, but there are a lot of commandments that are mentioned in Mishlei, most particularly the issues of morality and values, as are mentioned in Nevi'im, in the prophets, and in Psalms. Mishlei speaks about the importance of wisdom, of knowledge, of understanding, draws a direct connection to the story of creation, especially when you look at Chapter 3, Adonai b'chokhmah yasad haaretz koneh shamayim b'tvuna. There's a connection, and then that is where also the authors speak about Eitz Haim, which is wisdom or the Torah. So it's important to study Mishlei in order to shed light in other parts of Tanakh, and especially Bereshit. But other than that, when we look at the main, and it's scattered throughout the book, so I'm just going to mention the main topics, themes that Mishlei speaks about. He speaks about the importance of wisdom and intelligence, of being prepared, of being honest, transparent, loyal, committed, being reciprocal, always helping others. In 3:27, do not withhold good from one when you could help. This idea of always trying to help others, of being honest, being loyal to others, repeats again in chapter 5. Mishlei speaks a lot about the danger of being lazy. He advocates being expeditious, being always alert and prepared. And in a beautiful pasuk in 6:10, me'at shenot, me'at numot, me'at hibuk yadayim lishkav, uvakim halech reshecha u'machsorecha ki ish magen. When you tell yourself, let me have a little bit more sleep, a bit more slumber, a bit more hugging myself in bed, poverty will come calling upon you and want like a man with a shield, meaning that it will not sneak up upon the lazy person, but rather will come in broad daylight. That's the danger of being lazy. So these are the main themes of Mishlei. In addition, he denounces lashon hara, the people who badmouth other people, gossip, calumny, all types of damages that can be caused by talking. In chapter 11, he also speaks about the importance of being ethical in business. One of the few mitzvot that are clearly mentioned in Mishlei: false scales are an abomination to the Lord, and honest weight pleases Him. It's amazing to see that of all the kinds that are considered to'ava in Tanakh, idolatry, promiscuity, incest, the one that is mentioned here is Nehemiah, false scales or lack of business ethics. And that another theme that is mentioned in Mishlei is the importance of charity, of sharing your wealth with others, or not accumulating wealth, because eventually it will disappear. It will not stay forever. It speaks about the importance of peace, of being of speaking calmly with people. He repeats the issue of business ethics as important, and says that he who does not have honest scales and balances will be to'ava, abomination. This is chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. He speaks about the importance of being patient. So, all in all, when one reads through Mishlei, it could really call a series of moral and ethical teachings that that can guide a person. Again, in chapter 20, verse 10, Even va'even efa ve'efa, false weights and false measures are an abomination to the Lord. It seems that this has been a concern for Mishlei. We've seen it also in prophets, in Tehillim, and we could say that we see that also today, where unfortunately people feel that this is a negligible part of halakha, that it's okay to round corners in business. Meanwhile, this is one of the main themes that the Mishlei, Tehillim, and the prophets are concerned with, and one of the transgressions that are repeatedly referred to as Torah, abomination, very, very harsh term mentioned also in the Torah. So that is what we have in terms of halakha in Mishlei, values, moral teachings scattered throughout the book. The one mitzvah that is mentioned is business ethics over and over again, with some reference also maybe to adultery. But this is the main. Those are the main topics of the book. Following which, we have the book of Iyov. Very briefly, I'll discuss it here because it does not directly connect to halakha, but it does speak about the philosophy of halakha. Many books written about Job. But Iyov? What is the message of the book? Why was it necessary to write it? My opinion is that Iyov is a parable. It's a story that is meant to deliver a message. Iyov never existed. God would never have treated a person in that way. Iyov is the epitome of the person who is observant for all the wrong reasons. Iyov is constantly afraid of cursing God. And one would only be afraid of cursing God if he has a will or an intention to do so. So it's on the tip of his tongue, but he feels that as long as he doesn't expose it, God wouldn't know about it. So even when his children celebrate or have festivities together, Iyov brings sacrifice for them because he says, maybe they cursed God unbeknownst to me. Iyov observes the full body of Torah mitzvot. Why? Not because he feels that this is the right thing to do, but because he knows that God is more powerful than him, and he understands that in order to be rewarded and to be protected, he has to follow God's words. We know that because later on in the book, Iyov will say, I wish that there was someone, an arbitrator, that was greater than both of us, and then we could have an unbiased judgment. In other words, Iyov says, the only reason I have to obey you, God, I have to follow your word, is that you are more powerful than me. But if I were more powerful, or if we were equals, I would have been able to prove you wrong. And that is the undercurrent in Iyov's mind. And also later on we find the statement of the author, B'chol zot, lo hata Iyov b'sfatav. This is the end of in chapter 2, verse 10. With all that, Iyov did not express any heretical statement. He did not say it, but he did think it. So, as I said, I think the story here delivers a message, and the message is how to deal with the issue of theodicy, divine justice, good and evil. Why do good people suffer? But also, at the same time, deal with the question of why we do what we do, why we follow Torah and mitzvot. So, Iyov represents that school of thought that is selfish. I keep the Torah and mitzvot in order to be protected. As we mentioned several times, the core message of the Torah is ve'ahavta l'ra'acha kamocha, love the other as you love yourself. Bring all your powers and potential to fruition in order to be able to use them to help other people. Iyov does it for his own protection, for his own benefit, and therefore he turns the whole process into a selfish one. He does not stop to think whether the person in need needs charity or why is he suffering, but rather sees it as his obligation to the legal codex of the Torah. In other words, he is not transformed by his acts of charity, and if he is not transformed, other people around him cannot be transformed as well. We see that the people around him are not transformed because his children are protected by him. He brings sacrifices for them, but we don't see him talking to them about what is the right belief. His wife is unaffected by him because when he suffers, she suggests that he curses God and die, and we'll see why she does that. And his friends are unaffected by him because throughout their dialogue, it doesn't seem that they learn anything from him. The other indicator that Iyov is a person who does not affect his surroundings is in the book of Ezekiel, where Iyov and Noah are mentioned in the same verse. This is in chapter 14, verse 14 of Yehezkel. He mentions also Daniel, which is another issue, but basically he says if Noah and Iyov would be in the country, and the country would sin against me, they will only be able to save themselves. Iyov does mention a list of good deeds, of good actions that he does. This description appears in chapter 29 of Iyov, where he describes his greatness in his youth. He says, when I was in my prime, when God's company graced my tent, when Shaddai was still with me, when my legs surrounded me, when my feet were bathed in cream and rocks poured out streams of oil for me, when I passed through the city gates to take my seat in the square, young men saw me and hid, elders rose and stood, nobles held back their words, they clapped their hands to their mouths, the voices of princes were hushed, their tongues stuck to their palates, the ear that heard me acclaimed me, the eye that saw commended me. So he describes his greatness and his wealth and abundance and success. We already feel here the arrogance and the focus on Iyov's self accomplishment. And then he says, for I saved the poor man who cried out, the orphan who had none to help him. I received the blessing of the lost. I gladdened the heart of the widow. I clothed myself in righteousness, and it robed me. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was father to the needy, and I looked into the case of the stranger. I broke the jaws of the wrongdoer, and I wrested prey from his teeth. I thought I would end my days with my family and be as long-lived as the phoenix. Not necessarily that's the interpretation. Could be I will live, or I will be multiplied as the sand at the shores of oceans. But all that, what we see is that Iyov praises himself for his righteousness. It says that he was praised because of that, acclaimed by people, blessed by the needy. We don't feel that he feels that he is doing the right thing for the sake of doing good, but rather because this is the right thing to do within the system. In chapter 31, he says, "Brit karati le'enai u'mayit bonen al betula." I have covenanted with my eyes not to gaze on the maiden. I have not walked with worthless men. I help the needy, etc., and the orphan, etc. But all that, as I said, Iyov is doing it selfishly. How do we see that? We see by the response of his friends and his wife, by the fact that he was not able to affect his family, by the fact that he's mentioned alongside Noah. Noah is the epitome of a person who stands idly by when his generation is destroyed. He never asks for any mercy for them. He never tries to influence them. So what happens here? We have a story of a righteous man who's not changing the world, who is doing it only for himself and therefore misses the point. God afflicts him to see what happens, or to send us a message that this is not what God wants. And we have three responses which represent three schools of thought. Iyov, the moment he's afflicted, reaches the conclusion that the world is evil, that his destiny, that one's destiny is not determined by his actions, but rather by the astrological signs and by the constellation of the stars in the time that he was born. We see that in the verse where when he says, this is in chapter 3, verse 3. Eov said, may the day on which I was born perish, and the night it was announced a male has been conceived disappear. May that day be darkness. May God above have no concern for it. May light not shine. What does he mean by saying, may this night or day perish? He means that probably he is suffering because of his birthday, because he was born under a bad sign, and therefore he's suffering. Meaning, the whole system that God put in place is not just, is not correct, but he has no choice because he's the lesser being and he cannot dispute God's decisions. He must live in this world. His wife, on the other hand, says, you still believe in the system, you still have this innocence, curse God and you'll die. She also agrees that the world is cruel, that there's no system, no justice, but she says you have a way out, you can commit suicide. Eov's friends basically stick to the same narrative, which is, you are probably a sinner and you don't know it. This is evident in the words of Eliphaz Hatemani, chapter 4, verse 7. Think now, what innocent men ever perished? Where have the upright been destroyed? So this goes on back and forth throughout the book. There's a lot of text, verbiage to embellish the story, to cover the story, and only after we go through 31 chapters of the book, a new person appears out of nowhere, a fourth friend of Eov. His name is Elihu ben Berechel Abuzi, Mimishpahat Ram, and he's extremely angry with Eov and with his three friends. With Eov because he thinks he's more righteous than God, and with Eov's friends for thinking that Eov is a wicked person. So Elihu is going to give us a certain alternative interpretation that will not make Eov a villain or a righteous person. How is that possible? So we'll look at very briefly at the symbolism of his name. Elihu ben Berechel, Habuzi mimishpahat Ram. He contains contradictions. Elihu means he is my God. Berechel means to bless God, which is the euphemism used throughout the book of Eov to say to curse God. So here we have a person on the one hand is fully committed to God, on the other hand is averse to God. Then he's called Buzi Mishpahat Ram. Buzi is from the word bizayon, buz, shame, disgrace, someone who's rejected and disrespected. But he is Mishpahat Ram, he comes from a noble family. And the word Ram here probably alludes to Yirmiyahu, the same root of Yirmiyahu, which most probably was the author of the book. There are many similarities between Eov and Yirmiyahu. And Elihu now says he's going to provide an answer. In the traditional division of the chapters in the Tanakh, Elihu speaks for 3 chapters, Lamed Bet, Lamed Gimel, Lamed Dalet, before he gives his real answer. It's all introduction, but if we don't count chapters and we count verses, Elihu's introduction goes on for almost 100 verses until he makes his statement, and that is, I think, because Yirmiyahu, through the book of Eov, delivers a very powerful message that had to be concealed because it was so revolutionary. This is in chapter 35, verses 5, 6, 7, 8. Habet shamayim u'eh v'shor shehakim gavu mimeka im hatat amatif albo v'rabu v'shaycha ma ta'aseh lo. Behold the heavens and see, look at the skies high above you. If you sin, what do you do to him? If your transgressions are many, how do you affect him? Elihu tells Eov, and he tells us as well, our whole life of Torah and mitzvot, observing or transgressing them, does not affect God one bit. If God, as we believe in God is the creator of the heaven and the earth, the universe, how can my actions affect him? Please him or afflict him? Obviously not. So then Elihu goes on to say in verses 7 and 8, אם צדקת מה תיתן לו, ומם ידך ייקח, לאיש כמוך רשעך ולבן אדם צדקתך. If you are righteous, what do you give him? What does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects men like yourself, your righteousness, mortals. In other words, Elihu says, the whole purpose of Torah Mitzvot is tikkun olam, is making this world a better place. And that is why this statement is dangerous and why Yirmiyahu had to conceal it. Because basically Yirmiyahu says here that observing Torah Mitzvot cannot guarantee good life, good health, prosperity, against everything which is mentioned in the Torah. And I explained it previously. The reason that this happens is that God created the world for whatever reason He did, and put in place the system that we have to follow in order to make the world a better place. But in order for people to accept it in its initial stage, God had to market it to people. And the marketing tool was the promise of immediate reward, immediate punishment. Once we've accepted the Torah and started living by it, at a certain point those training wheels had to be removed and we have to be on our own. Now we are in this situation of being on our own, and this is what Elihu says. If you want to do the right thing, you have to do it because it's the right thing to do, and not because you want to secure a good life for yourself or for your descendants. If you do it, eventually, after several generations, and maybe not in your place, but in another place, people will live better. And we see today the efforts of scientists, of statesmen, of workers, of people from all walks of life. In the centuries that preceded us, were able to make the world that we live in today a better place than it was in the past, and our actions would make this world a better place for our future generations. Not necessarily I'm going to benefit one of my direct descendants, not necessarily I'm going to have descendants, but someone is going to benefit from me. And if we do that, if we think in that altruistic manner, everybody eventually will benefit. I think that is the message of Eov. Okay, following Eov, we have Shir HaShirim. This is a more theological statement rather than purely halakhic, but I'll just highlight one concept here. The idea of Shir HaShirim, I think the central theme is that unfulfilled potential. The moment that is beautifully described in the middle of chapter 5, where the beloved, the woman constantly seeks her beloved, and then in the moment that he appears and knocks on the door, she delays. She says, I cannot get up because I took off my robe. I need to put it back. How am I going to do that? I washed my feet. How am I going to step back on the ground and get them dirty? Then finally she decides to get up and try to open the door for him, but her hands are slippery because of the ointment that she put, and by the time she opens the door, her beloved disappears. This is a metaphor to a life of pursuing false ideas and then eventually waking up too late to find that our main potential has slipped from under our fingers. So I think that would be the main theme of Shir HaShirim, wrapped, of course, with metaphor, with love songs, etc., and that is of the unfulfilled potential or missing one's purpose in life, which is also extremely important for the observance of Torah Mitzvot. The next Megillah is Megillat Ruth. In Megillat Ruth we have several issues that are important from the point of view of Halakha, because they they bear resemblance to certain Halakhic concepts, but they're not there. I want to look at the Pshat. What we find here, that first, Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women with no indication of those women going through conversion or anything like that. When Ruth wants to go back with Naomi, she says, "Ba'asher telchi telech, ba'asher tarini arin amech ami ve'eloich Elohai, ba'asher tamuti amut v'sham ekaver." I will go with you. I will sleep wherever you sleep. Your people is my people. Your God is my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and that is where I will be buried. The rabbis in the Talmud use that to say that this is the negotiation that we have to have with people who want to convert. We tell them, that you have to walk differently, sleep differently, etc. But this is not the pshat of the pasuk. The pshat is that Naomi told her daughters-in-law, Lechna Shovna. First she tells them go back home, and then when Orpah turns back, Naomi says in 115, she went back to her nation and to her gods. And Ruth says, no, they are not my nation, they are not my gods, you are my nation, your God is my God. And it's basically a statement of faith, and that seems to be the process by which originally people converted to Judaism. It was just Kabbalat Mitzvot, and the Tevilah came later. In the case of men, the Milah came later. One could have converted the day after Pesach and not do Milah until the next Pesach, because Brit Milah was a requirement for eating Korban Pesach. In any case, this whether they went through the process of conversion as described in the Talmud or not, the important thing is that Ruth presents to us the future grandmother of King David, who's going to be the founder of the Davidic dynasty, as someone who comes from another nation. That is important. We also find in the book of Ruth a reference to the social structure, the laws of giving 10% to the poor and allowing them to gather wheat and grains in the fields. And we also have a reference to the Levirate law, to the law of Yibum. But unlike the Torah, which says that only the brother does Yibum, marries the widow of the deceased brother, the book of Ruth suggests that she will marry anyone from the family according to the lines of inheritance. So it's not clear whether this was an additional measure, meaning she did not do it because of Yibum, but rather in order to be protected by someone from the family, or that they did consider it a Yibum, and therefore we see that there is some incongruence between the way the mitzvah is described in the Torah and the way it was observed. In any case, what is clear is that for a goel, a redeemer, to marry the widow of a dead person was not an ideal situation, because in that case, the son, the fruit of that marriage would not be his. He would be named after the dead brother, and either by name or at least receive his inheritance, which means that the Yavam, the one who does the Levirate law, becomes in a way a surrogate father. That also sheds light on the story of Er and Onan in the book of Bereshit. As I mentioned when we discussed the issue there, Onan refuses to have a child from Tamar, Er's widow, because he knows that the child will not be his. His sin, for which is being punished and killed by God, is being selfish and not becoming the surrogate father for his brother's son, and it is not wasting his semen, as some people argue. So this is the book of Ruth. We go to the book of Echa. Echa obviously is a book of lamentation over the destruction, but here also there's a message. This book also was written by Yirmiyahu, and it has the same message as in the center of Iyov, as I mentioned before, and that is that message appears in chapter 3. Chapter 3 of Echa is an exception. Aleph, Bet, Daled are all alphabetical, and Hey 5 is the conclusion of the book. Also, each one of the other chapters deal with one aspect of the suffering of the destruction. The first chapter, the protagonist is Jerusalem. In the second chapter, the protagonist is God, what God did to the people. In the fourth chapter, the protagonists are the people of Jerusalem, and in chapter 5, there's the final dialogue between God and the author. But chapter 3 is interesting because it is focused on the author. Ani Gever Ha'oni has no relation to the destruction, but rather to one's personal suffering until the letter Nun. It's very much focused on Yirmiyahu's own experience. It also different because all other chapters have one verse per letter, whereas chapter 3 has 3 verses per letter and much shorter verses. Here again, I think that the message that Yirmiyahu wants to deliver is that, and that I think By the way, the book, the chapter 3 was written many years after the chapter 1, 2, 4, and 5 word, and it was inserted in the middle in a way to attract attention for people to understand that this comes later, maybe in a retrospect after the Churban, after the destruction. He says the following. This is in verses 35, 36, 37, 38, and 39. I mean, all these 35 to 39 of chapter 3 in Echa. He says this, להטות משפט גבר נגד פני העליון, לעוות אדם בריבו אדוני לא ראה. To deny a man his rights in the presence of the Most High, to wrong a man in his cause, this the Lord does not choose. Meaning, evil does not come from God. מי זה אמר ותהי? אדוני לא ציווה. מפי העליון לא תצא הרעות והטוב. He says, one cannot do anything without God's word, but מפי העליון לא תצא הרעות והטוב. At the same time, it is not at the word of the Most High that will and will befall. In the translation of the JPS, and other ways to read it is with a question mark. Is it possible? Is it possible that that good and evil will come not from the mouth of Hashem? But I think we could read it without a question mark. And he says, yes, it is not God who decrees upon us good and evil, but rather, of what shall a living man complain, each one of his own sins? We are the ones who bring evil to the world, and it is up to us to change the world. We should not turn to God to ask for forgiveness or for help or for support or for fighting evil until we have done all that is within our power to fight the evils of the world. This is in chapter. This is Eicha. Kohelet, also very briefly, not necessarily a book of halakha, but Kohelet is Kohelet could be compared to the logotherapy method of Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search of Meaning. He speaks about searching for purpose, searching for happiness, and maybe his conclusion is that in verse 17, it is good to eat and drink and get pleasure with all the gains he makes under the sun. Or in other words, live a positive life, because only that will allow you to share your wealth with others and to prosper in a way which is not selfish, but rather which benefits the whole community. Kohelet also speaks about the ills of government in chapter 5, verse 7. He speaks about patience and humility, wisdom, etc. But all in all, when one goes through Kohelet, which is worth learning, I would say even on a regular basis, what one finds is that Kohelet takes us on a roller coaster of opinions and philosophies to show us that at the end of the day, the philosophy that works is for each person to find what is right for him within the framework of his beliefs and the Torah, and to do good to himself in order to be able to do good unto others. From the book of Kohelet, we continue on to the book of Esther, and not that much halakha there, and for more in-depth analysis of the book of Esther, please see the series on the Megillah under the series of holidays. There are several installments of a discussion of the Megillah, and more will come. The book of Daniel, few halachot in the book of Daniel. One of them is the basis of the whole system of prayer, where the king made a decree that people will not be allowed to worship any other god except for any other gods except for his God, and that no one is allowed to pray. And the one person who it's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's Daryavesh in chapter Vav, chapter 6. Daryavesh is very close with Daniel, and the people the king's counselors who know of this special relationship between Darius and Daniel try to frame Daniel, so they get the king to make this decree of against prayer to anyone else, but Daniel would still do that, and this is in chapter 6, verse 11. We read this: Daniel כדידע דירשים כתבה על לביתה וחבין פתיחן לה בעיליתה נגד ירושלים וזמנין תלתה ביומה ומברך על ברכו ומצלה ומודה קדם אלהה כל כובל דאבה עובד מן קדמת דינה. Meaning that Daniel, even though that he knew that it was a decree against prayer, he would go to his house. He had windows open in his attic facing Jerusalem, and he would pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem and praying to God. That's the only reference we have to organized tefillah, but it's still individual in the Tanakh. The Talmud in Masechet Berachot uses that to learn many halachot regarding prayer, the direction of prayer, the 3 times a day, etc. But here the question remains: when exactly was the book of Daniel written? There are strong indications that it was written in the Greek period, maybe in the time of the Maccabim. One of this indication is the existence of Greek words in the text. This is on chapter 3, verse 15. It says, "Di tishmaun kal karana mashrokita katros sibcha psanterin vesumponia vekol zine zemara." When Nebuchadnezzar erected the statue that everybody was required to bow down to, it says that when they hear the sounds of music, they have to bow down. What are the musical instruments? Keren Mashrokit, which are Hebrew names, but also Katros, which is Kathros, it's a Greek word, Psanterin, also a Greek word, Psaltery, and Sumponia, which is translated bagpipe, but it comes from the same word as symphony, meaning sounds being made together, symphony. So, Katros, Psanterin, Sumponia, 3 Greek words in Daniel indicate that the book was written later than what it alleges to be, and therefore it could be at the same time when the rabbis established the obligation of prayer. From the book of Daniel, we continue to the book of Ezra. The important issues that we have to look at the book of Ezra in terms of halakha are interesting. We have, of course, Ezra speaks about the reconstruction of the temple, the reconstruction of the of the wall. The greatest concern of Ezra appears in chapter 9 is the assimilation. We have a description of a 50% assimilation between Jews and other nations. The book of Ezra claims that Ezra was able to sign people on a covenant and have everybody divorce their wives, but scholars believe that this did not happen. That would have been political and would say physical suicide for the new nation that is established in Israel after the exile, because for them to send back home hundreds or thousands of women that are now divorced because they're not Jewish would have been disastrous. So most scholars believe that this did not happen as described, meaning there was an incentive to do that, but it did not happen. Eventually, the book of Ezra is divided into 2, Ezra and Nehemiah. In chapter 5 of Nehemiah, we find that the wealthy people in Yehuda oppressed their brothers. They would lend money and eventually confiscate their fields and even take the people as slaves. But Nehemiah was able to convince the people to release the debtors and to forgive, to let go of the debts. He himself did it also. Another important Halakhic issue in Nehemiah is, and this is highly controversial in terms of interpretation, is the halakha of Sukkot. How does one build a sukkah? in chapter 8, verses 13 to 18, following a gathering and sort of an awakening, a spiritual awakening gathering that Azariah and Nehemiah conducted. The people found, the Torah says that you have to sit in the Sukkot on the 7th month. And what they did, it says, צאו והביאו עלי זית ועלי עץ שמן ועלי הדס ועלי תמרים ועלי עץ עבות לעשות סוכות ככתוב. Go out on the mountains and bring leafy branches of olive trees, pine trees, myrtles, palms, and other leafy trees to make booths as it is written. So there are two ways to read it. Either that they used the branches to build the actual sukkah, or that they both brought these species to hold as we do today. Not clear from the text. We'd follow the tradition here, but the text is intriguing. In chapter 9, there's a covenant signed between the people, the exiles who returned from Zion, Nehemiah and Ezra, and the ministers. They take upon themselves the following: to when they say Allah Shvu'ah, they make they accept upon themselves with vows and swearing to follow the word of God, and that is not to marry with the local nations, not to buy on Shabbat V'Yom Kodesh, which seems to suggest that this was not something that was included in the biblical prohibition, but that they took it as an extra measure on themselves, to follow the law of Shemitah, to follow the land of the 7th year, to give charity to the temple and the first fruits to the temple. These are the laws that people took upon themselves, and we have one more thing in chapter 13. Nehemiah says, at that time I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and others bringing heaps of grain and loading them onto donkeys, also wine, grapes, figs, and all sorts of goods, and bringing them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. I admonished them there and then for selling provisions. The pasuk is more than provisions. Beyom micham tzayid, game, meaning that they were hunting or fishing on Shabbat. The fish was brought by the people of Tyre in Lebanon. Nehemiah fights with them, and first he locks the gates of Yerushalayim for Shabbat, but they sleep, they stay outside the Homa, outside the wall, and eventually Nehemiah threatens them that if they spend the Shabbat outside the Homa in order to sell to those who come out, he will punish them, and they cease from doing so. Those two things are important because eventually, when we go into rabbinical law, we will see that one of the main concerns of the rabbis was limiting commerce on Shabbat, but none of the halachot that are related to commerce on Shabbat are biblical. Rather, they are, except for writing, but handling money is rabbinical, as well as exchanging goods, which raises the question whether this was included in the original Halakhic prohibitions of Shabbat in the Torah. With that, we have concluded the series of the Tanakh and the Halakhic mindset.